want to thank Bruno for the kind invitation to give my talk today here in Split. It's my father's hometown and my wife's hometown, so I always enjoy visiting this beautiful city. I also am very privileged to be speaking in front of Professor Weiler, someone who I've cited in some of my works in the past in my PhD dissertation on Europe. So I'm honored to have you here in the audience, Professor Weiler. So I'll be speaking today about woke ideology and the common good. And initially I would like to make just a few observations about recent history in Europe, in particular the collapse of communism in 1989 and some basic lessons we should draw from that. So as you know, the American sociologist Francis Fukuyama, coined the phrase the end of history, and he used this as a way to interpret the events of 1989. Basically, his argument was that with the end of the Cold War, the end of this ideological confrontation between and West, we had reached, as he said, the end of history. The West, with its idea of human rights and democracy, had prevailed. Communism had collapsed, and that we were entering a new phase where more or less it was undisputed that liberal democracy is the best model for ordering society, more or less. I'm simplifying his argument. He himself later made adjustments to his thesis, but he attracted a lot of attention in the early 90s with his writings. I would say that the first lesson we should draw is that the collapse of communism vindicated the view of man as Homo religiosus, not Homo economicus, but rather Homo religiosus. So despite what our views on communism may be, it's clear that it left a great emptiness inside the human heart. Pope John Paul II wrote very eloquently about this, that it wasn't just the dysfunction of the system, the economic stagnation that it caused, the fact that it could not compete with the West, but the root causes of the collapse of communism are deeper and involve this spiritual need of man for higher meaning, for purpose, and that communism could not satisfy this need. And that's why in the end, it lasted a long time, and communism was never really popular, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, but in the end it did collapse, largely, I would argue, because of the heroic leadership of people like John Paul II. If it hadn't been for leaders like this, and also in the United States, President Reagan and others, perhaps we would still be living under those former circumstances. Many politicians in the West, I believe, were very complacent and had actually accepted this reality, and did not have policies that were designed to actually lead to the defeat of communism. But in the end, we're lucky to be in a free Croatia today. Croatia, I'll just remind you, suffered under this ideology as well. There were terrible injustices, and I think our country has largely failed to confront the reality of our past. This is evident, for example, yesterday in Zagreb, many on the left were celebrating the so-called Liberation Day. Yes, Germany was defeated at the end of World War II, but unfortunately Croatia was not on the side of freedom. We were subjugated under new ideological chains, so to speak, with communism. So it's, I think, not correct to describe this event as liberation. It was new subjugation, a new form of tyranny. And so this causes a lot of discussion and controversy today, but I think it's important to initially say that the view of man as Homo religiosus, religious by nature, not just a consumer and producer, but with deeper spiritual needs. This view has been vindicated by these events in 1989. Secondly, I want to say that political ideologies, this goes for communism, Nazism, fascism, but also woke, so broadly understood as one in a series of political ideologies, actually in reality assumes the social function of religion. So in other words, if you don't agree with woke ideology, from their point of view, you're seen basically as a heretic, as someone who needs to be canceled, as someone unacceptable for mainstream society, someone that needs to be marginalized. And this is in fact how this ideology spreads, because there's absolutely no room for dissent. In that way, it's similar to communism. Communism, you could say, was cancel culture on steroids. Not only would you be marginalized, you could even be imprisoned or killed. So the communists were very good at canceling all those who disagreed. And the Catholic Church obviously understands this very well. The Catholic Church was the main target of the communists in many countries, including Croatia. And that's not by coincidence. So that's a claim I'm making, that these political ideologies, including woke, and I'll get to that, what is woke, what is understood as woke, function more as false religions than just a set of political ideas. And that's why we have so much intolerance, not to mention hypocrisy on this side of the debate, because they're really, in the end, not interested in discussion. They just want to have enough power to cancel you, so your voice is not heard. Okay, I'll have a seat because my notes are here on my computer. If there's anything you want me to clarify, or if there's something that's not understood, please don't hesitate to ask. So, what if woke ideology, if what I'm saying is correct, if it's another false religion, what are its dogmas? What does woke ideology teach? What does it represent? I would say wokeness describes, first of all, alleged social injustices that are caused by various factors like race, sex, or even gender identity. So inherent in Western culture, in our civilization, there are deep injustices, according to the woke ideologues, that are caused by these factors. These alleged injustices are inherent to our society and create a hierarchy of power in which certain groups oppress their victims. So they're very interested in deconstructing society and removing what they see as this pyramid of power. And they're interested in correcting or rectifying past injustices. So I don't know if you're following this. In California, there's an ongoing debate now about reparations, about whether the state should pay reparations to African Americans because of slavery. This is a debate now in the United States. So it's not just about today, it's about rectifying past injustices as well. So it is the responsibility of government, but also corporations, not just politics, but also business, to rectify these alleged injustices. Woke ideology also reinforces the idea that it is advantageous to be a victim. So this is something coveted. It's something the different groups badly want in the political struggle, to have a status of victim, which I find very dehumanizing and a dead end. It's a dead end and creates a lot of miserable human beings. But this is implied in woke ideology, that it's advantageous to be a victim. Where does this lead? Well, there's a Twitter account called End Wokeness on Twitter, which presents different cases where this leads. And I'll just mention one egregious example of where this ideology can lead. So one recent tweet showed a woman who blinded herself. She made herself blind, saying that she deeply felt that she should have been born blind, and is happier now. So she's happier as a blind woman. So she committed such an act, did so much harm to herself, because I would say she was indoctrinated and fell victim to this very dangerous ideology. So she blinded herself, and she was recently on television in America describing what led her to this decision. We also have, under the gender debate in the United States, this idea that we can transform and transcend our biological sex and, in accord with our feelings, become something else. And there's endless numbers of gender identity. I don't know what the latest number is. But first of all, this ignores biological reality. It's basically impossible to change your sex, which is defined at birth. It's not possible. So a cosmetic surgery from just the outside perception perhaps can reinforce this fantasy that someone is, who's a man is a woman, or vice versa. But in reality, because every single cell in my body is defined by an XY chromosome pair, I cannot change every cell in my body. So it's not by chance that no biologist, of my knowledge, no serious biologist would actually agree with the idea that you could change your sex. It's basically biologically, so it's a lie. It's a lie being sold to millions of people, and unfortunately children are being indoctrinated in this from the early years, from kindergarten even, in some cases. And so we have doctors now, who are willing to mutilate children, remove healthy body parts from children. And they prescribe puberty blockers, in other words, medication designed to prevent the natural process of puberty. They prescribe this to children as young as 11 or 12, in some places without the consent of parents. Now, this is extremely harmful and dangerous, and in my view, these doctors should be prosecuted. Now, it is not a coincidence that many gender transition clinics have been recently closed. They're not in business anymore. In England, the biggest one is Tavistock, recently closed. They've been also closing in the United States and in other countries. Why? Because many of these victims of transgender ideology are suing these clinics. They're suing them because they have regret, and they say that these experts did not warn them of the consequences. So these are permanent changes to a young person. They will permanently change the person's course of his or her life. And so it's very dangerous. And I think it's a very good sign that these gender transition clinics are starting to close. We have sports where males are allowed to compete against girls. This is happening in the United States. This is ridiculous. It's like a mockery of women's sports. For a long time, parents and young women were quiet. They felt uncomfortable in objecting to this, but now this is changing, and I think it's a good change. So they're starting to speak out, saying that this is ridiculous. We have the case of Leah Thomas in the United States, a swimmer, a male, who in one discipline, I think, won the competition by 10 seconds. So he was basically mocking these young girls who have trained their whole life to compete. So I think the tide is turning in other ways, but this is where this leads. It can lead to the end of female sports, for example. Because according to this theory, it's enough to declare yourself whatever gender identity, and we, the society, must oblige, right? We must oblige. So that's part of woke ideology. Then we have this phenomenon of woke capitalism. The reality of corporations becoming activist organizations, promoting this new dogma, this new set of beliefs. So when I grew up in the United States, corporations were strictly neutral on these controversial issues. They would not take sides on debates where society was divided. Corporations would avoid this. That has changed in the last 10 years. So we have corporations now becoming the main promoters of these ideas, woke. So they're not neutral anymore. They're actually they're on the vanguard. They're leading promoters of these ideas, corporations. So they support with great financial means. They have great power. These progressive causes. There's this phenomenon of virtue signaling, so signaling to customers what is good and bad, what is desired behavior. The corporations are engaging in this on a regular basis. We have, for example, the case in North Carolina where the state, through a law, basically stipulated that in public spaces there were only 2 bathrooms, male and female bathrooms, no neutral bathrooms, no transgender bathrooms in public spaces, just 2 bathrooms. And what happened after they passed this law? We had Facebook, Google, Apple, the leading big tech giants together signing a letter to the governor of North Carolina, threatening to boycott North Carolina. So huge American corporations threatening a state because the state simply passed a law saying that women have their bathroom, men have their bathroom. And corporations objected to this and threatened the state by saying they would close all their facilities and offices in North Carolina. So that's what's happening in America. So I, as someone born in the United States, now in Croatian politics, an example of where this leads is my own view about American investment. I used to be much more open and vocal about inviting American companies to invest in Croatia. I'm not so sure anymore, because with American companies comes woke. It's part of the package. I don't want woke to undermine common sense and decency and what Croatian culture is. I don't want this to be happening, but that's what corporations are doing. And I have many friends in the business community in Zagreb and in Croatia who tell me that they're coming under pressure from woke. They're working with foreign clients, and this is part of the culture. Okay, so that's a little bit about woke, and I'd be happy to answer any questions. It's much broader than that, but just as an introduction. Now, what is the common good? So we have woke ideology and the common good. How do we properly understand what the common good is? So I saw the compendium of the social teaching of the church. That's what I rely on for this. Thank you, Bruno. That's what I'll rely on for this definition, but it's, I think, very clear, and I'll just read it. So the common good does not consist in the simple sum of the particular goods of each subject of a social entity, belonging to everyone and to each person. It is and remains common because it is indivisible, and because only together is it possible to attain it, increase it, and safeguard its effectiveness with regard also to the future. So just a clarification. So we have this understanding, even preceding the Catholic Church with Greek philosophy, of man's social nature. So Aristotle writes a lot about this, that man is created as a social being, meaning that to attain full happiness, to flourish as a human being, we must belong to a society. We cannot attain this alone. So we're by nature social. And the Catholic Church integrates this truth into a new vision. So man is social. That's why it's common. It's not just, we don't have just goods pertaining to individual persons. There's something called the common good. So just as the moral actions of an individual are accomplished in doing what is good, so too the actions of a society attain their full stature when they bring about the common good. The common good, in fact, can be understood as the social and community dimension of the moral good. So we have to know, first of all, I think this is a clear definition, but we have to know even more fundamentally, what is good? What is good? And I'll again rely on Greek philosophy, because I don't want this lecture just to be an apology for the Catholic faith, although I do believe the Catholic faith is true. There are certain philosophical truths that don't rely on faith, that, for example, great pagan thinkers were able to comprehend. So Aristotle writes a lot about this. What is good? What is the good life? What is human flourishing? And of course, he describes a pyramid, again, a natural hierarchy of good. So they don't all have equal value. So he makes distinctions. And he says that at the highest point, the top of the hierarchy, is something he describes as eudaimonia. So this is happiness in the full sense, not just as a fleeting emotion. You know, when I saw my newborn son, I was very happy, but that passes, that feeling goes away. Aristotle is describing a state, a spiritual state of happiness that has enduring value over time. And he sees this as the highest good. So it exists only for its own sake, and there's nothing beyond this happiness. There's nothing higher. Below there's many goods. Many goods. So we're here, for example, maybe for friendship. That's a very important good. Knowledge, human knowledge is a very good. That's why I think students come to university. They want knowledge. They don't want to be confused. They want to hear the truth and attain real knowledge. That's why they come enroll to universities. Health is an important good. Honor. So if Luka Modric is a great soccer player. He's honored by many people in the world, and of course in Croatia, because he excels at what he does, and he deserves honor. He deserves honor. Leah Thomas, the swimmer who is competing against girls, does not deserve honor. He deserves contempt, I would say. Contempt, not honor. But people like Luka Modric deserve honor. So that's a human good, and it leads to happiness. So Aristotle would say it's very good for Luka to be honored and popular and to have maybe 20 million followers on Instagram. But that doesn't necessarily mean that Luka will be happy, right? It's an important good, but there's a higher good beyond honor. But this is how he's thinking. And I think this all makes sense. This is rational. This is reasonable. And of course, for philosophy to be true, it has to be universal. So what Aristotle is presenting in his philosophy has universal application. So he's not saying this is true for Greeks. He's saying this is universally true. Every human person wants this, right? And this is the way I would say this understanding of faith and reason is very important in the Catholic Church. That the Catholic Church takes from pagan philosophy, for example. Pope Benedict describes this as the Hellenization of Christianity. So he sees this as a providential, divine plan in God's intention for humanity. That we have before Christ Greek philosophy that is asking the right questions. And then Christ provides the final answer, really, to these questions. So virtue is very important to Aristotle. So this theory of virtue ethics, I think it's a forgotten word. I tried to use it sometime in my debates in Parliament and on television to even say it explicitly, the word, because my students and young people have never heard of this word. It's not used in common discourse today. So in Croatian, it's krepost or vrlina. That's the word, krepost or vrlina. I don't know the last time you heard the word krepost in public, but it's an important word. It's an important word. Okay, I want to move along and mention next the importance of culture in all of this. So the woke people want to control public opinion. They want to control the narrative. If you're familiar with the Italian thinker Antonio Gramsci, he was describing this game plan for the left, this march through the institutions, how to gain control of important institutions, and basically through indoctrination and prohibiting any dissenting voices, you obviously gain political power, right? The left benefits from this hold that they have in academia, for instance. In the United States, we have cancel culture on campuses. We have the mainstream media, which no longer even pretends to be impartial, but is completely one-sided, largely one-sided. And so these are things that are important because they influence the reality around us. Now, one writer that clearly saw this and wrote a great deal about this was the English historian Christopher Dawson. If you haven't heard of him, I would suggest Googling his name. He's very, I would say, not, he doesn't get enough attention, especially after Vatican II. He kind of fell to the margins and was forgotten. But he was a very important writer between the two world wars and also after World War II, up until the 60s. He died in 1970, Christopher Dawson. He spent 4 years at Harvard teaching. He was invited by the university to teach from England. Apparently didn't like it very much, so after 4 years went back to England. But he has been a subject of much of my research, and his argument was basically this, that there's no neutrality when it comes to culture. It either, in the Western case, will be defined by the dominant religion, Christianity, or let's say the Judeo-Christian tradition, the biblical tradition, going back to Judaism, but then later the influence of Christianity. So it will either be that, or it will be non-Christian. There's no neutrality, which is very interesting. For some time, especially in England, I think you saw this attempt with liberalism to have kind of a neutral space where different faiths would be tolerated. But the liberalism that was successful was actually largely defined by Christian principles. So I would argue was a Christian liberalism. So once you separate liberalism from Christianity, it becomes empty, and I would say too weak to provide a support basis for a free society. It becomes too weak. And then other ideologies come in and crush liberalism. That's actually, I think, what we're seeing in countries like Canada and the United States. Liberalism really not able to provide a coherent basis for a free society. It's coming under pressure from these new ideologies. So, Dawson, he said, as the influence in Europe of Christianity diminished with secularization, with the removal of religion from the public square, something new necessarily would come to replace it. So there's no vacuum. There's no possibility for a vacuum. Something new has to come in and replace it. And he saw this as these new ideologies, whether they were communism, fascism, today woke. These are the new religions that necessarily have to replace Christianity, which by many has been rejected, by the elites at least. So he used the term secular counter-religions. That's what he describes them as, secular counter-religions. So not woke ideology, but woke, the counter-religion of woke, would be how Dawson would describe it. Now, one example, just one of many, of what happens to a society when religion is separated from culture is in the West, this new understanding of marriage and the family. So marriage and family today are no longer non-controversial, they're very controversial. I myself was involved in a national referendum to define marriage in the Croatian constitution in 2013, 10 years ago. And there was a national vote. The government was hostile at the time, but we had collected enough signatures, and there was, in the end, a vote, and it was 2-1 to define marriage as a union of one man and one woman in the Croatian constitution. Many people object to this. Many politicians who serve with me in parliament ignore this constitutional change. They behave like it didn't happen. So marriage and family has become highly controversial. Even my students at a Catholic university, when I ask them, what is marriage? I think they know what marriage is, but they're a little reluctant to say out loud what it is. But it's defined in the Constitution, but they want to be, at times, politically correct. So marriage, I've mentioned gender identity, I call it gender madness, but gender ideology. But marriage and the family have become, the new battleground for these competing ideas, right? So I use the term, which the left doesn't like, but I use it, but I think it's the correct term, the natural family. The natural family. There's something that exists that it can be described as the natural family. So other people can say, well, my family consists of 2 fathers, or maybe a male and 2 wives, polygamy, this kind of thing. But I would say the natural family is 1 man, 1 woman, the father and mother and the children. That's the natural family. And that's not a religious definition. I believe marriage is a sacrament. I believe it is anointed by God. But you don't have to be a practicing believer to recognize that this definition of marriage is true. Because it's reasonable. Someone like Aristotle or Cicero would say, yes, that's the family. That's by nature what the family is. It's reasonable. You don't have to have infused knowledge or grace to understand this. We know that the Supreme Court in the United States, in the Obergefell-Hodges decision from 2015, solemnly redefined what marriage is. So all of a sudden we have a new interpretation of the Constitution. And the deciding vote was Anthony Kennedy, a Reagan appointee. So that's the irony. He was appointed by a Republican president to the court. But I would say there's a metaphysical misunderstanding of marriage and on abortion as well by many judges. So there's metaphysical confusion. Metaphysics deals with first principles. So if we don't get first principles right, eventually we end up with bad law, bad interpretations of law. And Justice Kennedy believes that defining marriage just as between 1 man and 1 woman discriminates against other forms of marriage. Now, I believe that reduces marriage to something it's not. Marriage is not just an emotional bond between two individuals. That's not what marriage is. Marriage has a deeper purpose than just an emotional bond. I can be friends or, have very close emotional attachments with many people, but I can't be married to them. So it's not about emotions or feelings or commitment to one person who may be of the same sex. That perhaps exists in human relationships, but it's not marriage. Marriage is something else. And it's important to define what marriage is, because if we don't have a good definition, it could be anything. Could be anything. Okay, I'm running out of time, so I hope this so far has been clear, so there may be some questions. But I want to conclude with this misconceived notion of what rights are. So in the classical tradition, what was of central importance was understanding the good, right? Understanding the good. Today, in politics, in our age, people don't talk about the moral good because we don't agree on what is good. They talk about rights. What are my rights, right? So if it's Leah Thomas, I have a right to compete against girls. That's my right. And I can't be discriminated against. So there's this mass confusion, and it leads to new injustices, because I would say this is greatly unjust to all the girls who want to compete on a level playing field. There have been even cases, unfortunately, in the United States of males who declared themselves as females allowed in violent sports, in ultimate fighting. So seriously injuring a woman, crushing, doing harm to the skull of a female boxer, because this is allowed. So this is where this leads. Now the male boxer would say, it's my right to, pound this female into the ground. That's where woke ideology leads. Now I'm not exaggerating, this is happening. This is not an exaggeration, this is happening. So I think there's confusion on fundamental principles, and this is why a return to metaphysics is important. Metaphysics deals with these questions. It's very important as a discipline in philosophy. I would say we have to take culture seriously. I'm in politics, but I think culture in the end is actually more important than politics. So who is winning the, let's say, war of culture and the hearts and minds of the youth will have obviously an easier time in politics. And that's why the left wants to control, for example, public education. It's impossible for woke ideology, I think it's just nonsense, but woke ideology to spread without control of public education, because parents on their own, naturally, are not raising children to think in this way. So they have to be indoctrinated. And it's a huge difference whether you're introduced to ideas like this when you're 18 or 6. So an 18-year-old, a student of mine, can process this information. Right? They're mature, they can process. But a 6-year-old is really a victim of this, of being indoctrinated. So it's a form, I would say, if it happens early, it's a form of abuse, emotional abuse. Introducing children, sexualizing children at an early age is very dangerous. But it's happening all over the West, including the United States. Okay. I'll stop there. It's already 12:45, so I'm trying to stay on schedule. Again, I don't believe it's possible for a neutral solution. What undergirds our present liberal democracy is basically moral relativism. So this idea that everyone can decide what is good or bad for him or her, and this is incoherent. Doesn't make any sense. Something has to be true. So if I say relativism is true, I'm making a truth claim. I'm saying relativism is true. So relativism quickly collapses. It can't be philosophically, doesn't make any sense. So anyway, I appreciate your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, if there are questions or some comments, please raise your hand and we will discuss it. But I want to mention the Pope Francis, I think in Laudato Si, said that we often think not about culture but technology as a neutral thing that we can operate how we want. But he stated there that even technology is not a neutral thing because it defines the way we think and we use it, and it defines us at the end. So would you agree with that, that it's not just culture that cannot be neutral, but it's technology?
Yes, I would say this technology we're talking about, AI for instance, artificial intelligence, it couldn't exist without human input. So it's basically in a mechanical way. It's machines, highly powered machines, processing huge amounts of data. But the input is coming from human beings. And what we've seen initially from artificial intelligence is it's already very biased. So I saw on one, this was online somewhere, there was a input from someone into a chat box asking for a joke about Christ, a joke. And the machine provided a few examples of jokes about Christianity, about Jesus Christ. And the same person, I think, then entered, he wanted a joke about Islam, and the artificial intelligence said that it couldn't provide any jokes about Muhammad. So you see already there a serious bias, and even the machine is trying to be politically correct. So in other words, there's no neutrality because human beings, and unfortunately all this power that AI provides can be easily abused. So I tend to be on the side that says that this needs to be strictly regulated, not loosely, but strictly regulated, because unfortunately, human history shows that human beings, as flawed creatures, can easily abuse power. And what's at our fingertips now, today, with this new technology, surpasses anything we've had in the past. So it's a very dangerous time, I would say, not to mention how it undermines virtue. So you're going to be having students who don't have to think or write, papers on their own. They just do the input, and artificial intelligence produces you a very nice paper, maybe even a dissertation. So students are going to have to work less to get through the coursework. And I think in the future, professors are going to have to devise ways to counter what they're getting from artificial intelligence. But again, these students are very clever, so they'll find new ways around, this detection, right? So it provides incredible possibilities, but in the end undermines virtue, because you will have dishonest students, you will have students who don't work hard, who aren't capable of even reading a book because they just go on Google and they use the artificial intelligence. So in a way, it's not good overall for society.